A single Panther tank sat in a British ordnance yard outside Isigny, Normandy, in July 1944, its glossy plate scarred by 3 separate strikes from a 17-pounder gun, and only one had actually penetrated. The other 2 had shattered the plate outward in radiating fractures, throwing fist-sized chunks of armor steel into the tank's own interior without the round ever fully breaking through. On paper, the Panther's frontal armor was close to impenetrable at normal combat ranges, 80 mm of sloped steel angled at 55 degrees, giving an effective thickness of over 140 milliliters against most Allied guns. British intelligence officers who examined the wreck weren't interested in the hole. They were interested in the cracks. Standard wisdom among Allied tank crews in the summer of 1944 held that the Panther was simply better armored than anything they had. Crews who'd watched Sherman's bounce round after round off Panther glacis plates at ordinary combat ranges had every reason to believe it. German armor doctrine emphasized hardness, a face-hardened plate that would shatter or deflect incoming shot before it could penetrate, a design philosophy that had worked reasonably well earlier in the war on the Panzer IV and early Tiger production runs. Critics of Allied gun development pointed to this and argued the real problem was firepower. The 75 mm gun on the standard in Sherman simply lacked the velocity to beat that geometry. Full stop. They weren't wrong about the geometry. They were wrong about the metal. What the metallurgists attached to 21st Army Group's technical intelligence teams found, plate after plate, was that German armor quality had quietly collapsed over the preceding 18 months, and that the cause was traceable, predictable, and visible before a single shot was fired. The secret wasn't in what the armor was shaped like. It was in what it was made of, and increasingly what it wasn't. Face-hardened and homogeneous steel armor of the kind Germany had produced through 1942 depended on a specific recipe: chromium and nickel for toughness and corrosion resistance, and, critically, molybdenum, which prevented the steel from becoming brittle when it was hardened or when it cooled after welding. Germany had never had reliable domestic molybdenum sources. Its pre-war supply came almost entirely through imports, much of it via routes that Allied blockade and the loss of North African and Balkan trade access had steadily strangled by 1943. Krupp and other armor producers responded the only way they could. They substituted. Vanadium in some batches, increased manganese in others, and in the worst plates examined by British teams, next to nothing. Armor hardened through heat treatment alone, with none of the alloying elements that kept hardened steel ductile under shock loading. The result was a plate that could be exceptionally hard enough to make a low-velocity round skip off the surface entirely, exactly as crews reported, while being catastrophically brittle under repeated or off-angle impact. British examiners who cut sections from captured Panther and late-model Tiger hulls found something the design specifications never mentioned: microfracturing radiating from weld seams before the plate had ever seen combat, an artifact of the steel cracking internally as it cooled after the hardening process. A molybdenum alloyed plate flexes briefly under impact and returns to shape, absorbing energy in the process. A brittle plate doesn't flex, it shatters, sending fragments of the tank's own hull into the crew compartment as lethal secondary projectiles, whether or not the round that hit it actually penetrated. This is where the metallurgical findings stopped being a laboratory curiosity and became a predictive tool. Testing at the Fighting Vehicles Proving Establishment through late 1944 established what came to be called the shatter gap, a band of impact velocities, generally between roughly 1,500 and 2,600 feet per second, depending on the specific plate and angle, where a projectile struck with enough energy to fracture the brittle armor, but not enough to achieve a clean penetration through ductile deformation. Below that band, the round simply bounced. Above it, the round went straight through with less drama. Inside the band, the armor broke apart. Once British and American gunnery officers understood this, it explained something crews had been reporting anecdotally for months without anyone connecting the pattern. Hits that shouldn't have worked, at ranges and angles theoretical penetration tables said were marginal, that nonetheless killed the tank. At Villers-Bocage in June 1944 and in the fighting around Caen through July, after-action reports from Sherman Firefly crews described results that made no sense against the published penetration figures for the Panther's glacis. A 17-pounder APCBC round, striking the lower front plate at an oblique angle, a shot the manufacturer's own armor tables suggested should ricochet or fail to penetrate, instead produced total crew casualties, the plate visibly cracked open rather than punched through cleanly. One Firefly gunner's report from the fighting near Caen, cited in a subsequent technical intelligence summary, noted simply that the round had gone in sideways, describing a spray of fragmentation from a plate that had fractured along an internal flaw line rather than yielding in the smooth, cone-shaped deformation pattern British ballisticians expected from properly tempered steel. Examined afterward, the plate showed the same radiating crack pattern the Isigny metallurgists had already documented, and, by that point, had begun cataloging systematically by manufacturing date and factory of origin. That cataloging was the real innovation, and it's what separated this from an interesting one-off discovery. By cross-referencing plate hardness, fracture pattern, and stamped production codes recovered from knocked out and captured vehicles, British technical intelligence built something close to a quality timeline for German armor output. Panthers, built at Maschinenfabrik Niedersachsen Hanover in early 1943, showed the ductile, well-tempered fracture patterns of properly alloyed steel. Vehicles from the same production lines in late 1944 showed increasing brittleness, correlating almost exactly with documented molybdenum shortages reported through captured German industrial correspondence. A tank's build date, in other words, had become a rough proxy for how it would actually behave under fire, not because the blueprint had changed, but because the steel behind the blueprint had quietly degraded. This mattered operationally in a way that pure gun versus armor calculations never could. Allied tank crews couldn't read a chassis number before engaging, but their commanders could adjust doctrine based on aggregate intelligence, hold fire for oblique shots that theoretical tables said were marginal, because a meaningful fraction of the Panthers they'd face were built from steel that would fail exactly the way the metallurgists predicted. Gunnery training material issued to some Allied units through late 1944 incorporated exactly this logic, encouraging crews to take shots that pure penetration mathematics from 1943 would have called a waste of ammunition. Commanders and ordnance officers who pushed this doctrine weren't dismissing German engineering, and the metallurgists who built the case weren't claiming German armor. Design was flawed on paper. The angle, the thickness, the hardness profile were all sound choices against the threats German engineers had designed for in 1941 and 1942. What broke down wasn't the design. It was the industrial base underneath it. And a design that assumes a steady supply of alloying elements stops being the design once that supply disappears. A tank's armor isn't just a shape. It's a shape made from a specific recipe of metal, and the recipe had been silently rewritten by attrition, blockade, and a strained war economy substituting whatever was on hand for whatever the original specification actually called for. This is also why the discovery didn't show up as a triumphant single moment, but as a slow accumulation of evidence that took metallurgists, ordnance officers, and frontline gunnery reports working together to piece into something usable. No single test proved it. It was the pattern across dozens of examined hulls, cracks that shouldn't have been there in properly tempered steel, hardness readings that were too high relative to the toughness the plate displayed, fracture surfaces with the grainy, crystalline look of steel that had never been given the ductility alloying was supposed to provide. That built a case solid enough to change how gunners were trained to shoot. By the time Allied forces were fighting through the Ardennes in the winter of 1944 and into Germany itself in early 1945, technical intelligence summaries were routinely flagging captured or destroyed Panthers and Tiger Segos by apparent manufacturing quality. And the pattern held. Later war vehicles failed more often, more catastrophically, and at combinations of range and angle that earlier penetration tables would have called safe for the German tank. What began as a curious observation on a scarred glacis plate outside Isigny had become a working predictive model, one grounded not in guesswork about German intentions, but in the unglamorous, exacting work of cutting steel samples, reading hardness gradients, and matching fracture lines to factory codes. The lesson the metallurgists drew from all of it wasn't really about tanks. It was about the gap between a design specification and the object that actually rolls off a production line under wartime pressure. A blueprint doesn't fight. Steel does. And steel, unlike a blueprint, remembers every shortage, every substitution, and every corner cut to keep the assembly line moving, whether or not anyone bothered to write it down.